This is Mary Ann Halford with GEMA's vidcast series. I have the great privilege today to be with my good friend and colleague, Tim Hanlon, who is truly one of the more visionary people in the world of advertising and television advertising, with a long storied career, both in the holding companies and now as an independent entrepreneur. How are you doing today, Tim?
I'm doing all right. Thank you, Mary Ann. I appreciate the kind words, and more importantly, thank you for having me, and I hope you're doing okay so far. It's, shall we say, may you live in interesting times.
I didn't bargain for this interesting, although sometimes it's a bit monotonous, so I don't know if I can call monotony interesting. How is your family doing?
Thank you for asking. Doing well. You know, it's the high order problems, right, of you know, being around each other for long periods of time. But it's interesting that I have two teenage daughters, one in high school, one getting ready to go to high school. And I've actually been pleasantly surprised. You can imagine the friction that often comes with two teenage daughters between themselves as well as the rest of the family. Yeah, but I've been surprised at their inventiveness and their resilience and their creativity. Some interesting art projects. My younger daughter is obsessed now with juggling over the last week or so, learning how to do that. So would these things have happened without maybe this kind of thing? So I'm trying to look for and accentuate the positive, as I'm sure you are too.
Yes, absolutely.
And you've got a college-age daughter, right?
Yes.
Who's
doing long distance learning. Her most interesting classes is when she's doing acting remotely. Gets a little heated, okay? So one day I didn't know if she was having an argument with one of her girlfriends or if she was in class, and I finally figured out it was class. So,
well, I guess you could put all this in context. I mean, these are arguably higher order problems versus, I'm sure you know people, we certainly do. It's, you know, it's frightening on a lot of different levels. And, you know, let's just hope that over time we'll all be able to collectively figure out, you know, being hunkered down for a period of time, you know, is more of an inconvenience than it is some of the bigger problems that could be out there. So for me, it's blessings, and we work from there. So, but thanks for asking.
And tell me how things are going with the Vertere Group right now. And first of all, why don't you let the audience know what Vertere does, and then just give us a sense as to some of the things that you're up to during this period.
Oh, I appreciate that, and all the excitement that comes with it. So Vertere Group is essentially boutique consulting and advisory. So yours truly, as you mentioned, spent a ton of time in the advertising agency holding company spaces, Publicis Group, Interpublic Group. And a lot of the work that I did there was focused on whatever you want to call it, sort of future or next generation or innovation types of things at the edge, right? Things that we take for granted now, like live streaming or the DVR. I could tell you stories about TiVo and Replay TV from 2000 to 2001, right? But always sort of peering across the aisle as to sort of what might be interesting and or relevant to media or advertising or marketing, all those kinds of things. And the last two gigs that I had at those holding companies was founding and running ventures practices. So got very experienced and intimate with the ins and outs of startups and entrepreneurs, and especially in this space of media and advertising and marketing. And you know, a lot of exits, a lot of interesting companies that, you know, are actually household names and stuff. And that is actually the kernel, that sort of ventures advisory-esque work with early stage firms in and around these spaces. That is kind of the kernel of what Vertere Group does. So we do, I would say, a third of our activity is advising early stage firms about how to navigate, how to partner with bigger firms, how to maybe disrupt if they've got a better mousetrap. You know, we had a few exits last year, like Pluto TV and Data Plus Math and Clipped. You know, so these are all companies that are now part of bigger organizations that found out something that they needed to tackle and they felt was valuable. And obviously over time, 4 years in each case, frankly, that they needed to be acquired by a bigger entity because they were onto something. The other 2/3 really is more classic, I would say. The 1/3 is classic consulting. So we work with big media firms struggling with a lot of those early stage firms. Like, what do we do about X or Y? What is this? we'll talk about this later, ATSC 3.0 next gen TV thing. This is sort of prepping, shall we say, or hand-holding bigger organizations that are, shall we say, economically focused on preserving the today in media and advertising and marketing, and enlightening them to the things that are likely to eventually, or maybe sooner than they think, disrupt or change their businesses. And frankly, maybe to the positive. And then that other third is helping financial folks, private equity and venture capitalists and other people with dough that kind of want to make heads or tails of either the big companies looking towards the entrepreneurs or the entrepreneurs looking at the big companies. They want to make some sense of what's real, what's going to change, what's going to evolve. Shake vigorously, and that's been a very nice model for us, knock on wood, for the last 6 or 7 years. And we are proverbially, as I'm sure you are too, open for business, and it's never dull, let's put it that way.
Exactly. Well, talking about helping guide people through change, there's a lot of impact of this COVID crisis on the TV advertising market. And one has to look at it on a multi-layered level. I mean, there are the national networks over the air, cable TV networks, but then you have local broadcasters, and then you have the AVOD services. How do you wind up looking at what's happening right now to the overall TV advertising ecosystem, and how do we look at it through those various lenses?
Well, there are a couple of dynamics. I think one is sort of the classical, I guess, cyclical kind of approach to let's call them economic downturns. Right now, obviously, this one is much more pronounced and has a lot of other aspects to it that have still, frankly, various aspects yet to play out. Right, but it's easily understood that this is, if not a recession, certainly an economic pothole and then some, right? And in those kinds of situations, and I've had enough of a longitudinal exposure to this crazy business and industry to kind of have, frankly, dating back to my Georgetown years, right? So I'm an '88 graduate, and you young whippersnappers out there don't remember, one of the more dramatic market drops was in the, I guess it was the late fall of '87, right? And talk about being a senior, trying to figure out what you wanted to do in life, which for me was around the sort of journalism kind of thing. But I kind of tried to pivot a little bit and recognize, well, okay, maybe my friends at CBS or the Washington Post or Sports, they're not going to be hiring per se, or in the near term. Maybe I should broaden my horizons to things like maybe media, and then advertising sort of crept into that. So, but you could also look at 2008, 2009. This is actually more pointed. The tendency, right, is to kind of freeze spending. Certainly to, I think right now what's going on is a scramble, more about sort of rescheduling, pausing, if there's the ability to get some new creative that's more, less tone deaf, shall we say, or more reality centric to what's going on. I think that's really the mode that most people are in right now on the buy and the sell sides. It's more about sort of maintaining some level of continuity until things can be sort of figured out for longer terms. But when you look at sort of the second, third, fourth quarters, it's really a complete pause and or slashing of budgets in the nearest terms. And that's affecting all kinds of things, literally day by day, into what the upfront season looks like, for example, right? So yours truly has been very much at the sort of chafing edge of questioning the dynamics of a hallowed yet antiquated kind of system, right? It's a buy forward kind of marketplace where, you make bets and you make some wholesale purchases ahead of time in TV inventory for the course of an entire sort of broadcast season and year. But it is very antiquated because the commitments are not sort of in stone and you can kind of move them around. And frankly, the money expended on during these next couple of months would have been these great lavish parties with great shrimp and cocktails at some of the fanciest places in New York, talking about touting all the great shows coming up. And, look, a lot of what's going on now, crisis-wise, is going to exacerbate some of the shall we say, weak elements or questionable setups of the television and advertising ecosystems, right? So I'm not saying it's like kind of told you so, but it is kind of it's a gigantic stressor on issues that were perhaps able to be stalled by tradition, process, big money companies and all that kind of stuff, or was doing its noblest to kind of stall and delay fundamental changes that were happening, such as streaming, such as addressable targeting, such as data-driven AI and all those kinds of things. Frankly, the systems by which people add buy and add sell, right, are very creaky and old and by hand and Excel spreadsheet based. These are all now not only crisis driven, like what are we going to do, and you know, heroic efforts by lots of people to keep the trains running in this silly business, but it now really calls into relief starkly, you know, some of the processes and systems and traditions that we've done don't seem to really make much sense if we envision a more sober and maybe more realistic approach going forward, maybe with less people and all that stuff. So I think it's twofold. There's a short-term stuff, but then there's the longer-term things that are really starting to present themselves. And I think that's the interesting stuff that all of us have to figure out soon.
So when you talk about those processes, I mean, obviously I can understand holding back spend right now, and obviously hotel companies and airlines have definitely diminished what they're spending. Cruise companies, you're not seeing those commercials any longer. And I have noticed the number of advertisers have changed, the quality, the tone of their ads, where they're focusing on how we're all living our lives right now. Yet that's current. What are the processes that you think will get fixed or maybe accelerated during this period, that the ones that you call creaky? How do you see the processes evolving over the next 12 months and maybe accelerated as a result of this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I mean, and I reserve the right to be completely wrong on all these, but some ones that come to mind that I'm sort of hear people sort of generally question now. One is, and you see, for example, what NBC Universal has done, right? They have said for at least how long this sort of crisis lasts, which could be frankly indefinite, they're going to reduce ad loads in their premium programming, right? So instead of, I don't know what a primetime network program now is, I think it's approaching something like 18 to 20 minutes maybe of advertisements in an hour linear program, which is just, you know, if you don't have the luxury of having recorded it and be able to fast forward it, it's just painful from a consumer experience perspective. But I think the short-term part of that is, hey, our advertising dollars and commitments are starting to dry up or at least pause, so we're not going to have as many. Second, there's not a lot of new money to replace that. And third, you know, this is something that's been in the back burner in the back of our minds for some time, is the consumer experience, right? Because linear television, live linear television, right, is already under duress, right? We'll talk about the elimination of sports in a minute, of how that makes it almost collapse completely. But at least NBC Universal has recognized, hey, maybe we should lower ad loads, right? Maybe we can make that experience a little bit better. And frankly, I think that's an overdue thing when, in a world of DVRs and on-demand streaming and all that kind of stuff, the majority now of television consumption, quote unquote, is not live and linear anymore. So why do we stuff 20 minutes worth of commercials in an hour program? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It really conceptually didn't before the crisis hit. It really doesn't make a lot of sense now. And if there's a new normal.
How are they going to bookend that hour then? If they reduce the ad load, obviously they'll have smaller breaks within, but then you're going to be at the end with 10 minutes. So what are they going to fill that?
That's a good question. I suspect that some of that can be filled with more interstitial types of programming. You could probably make that sort of a sponsored kind of content kind of offering, but I think it also starts the ball rolling towards what networks might start to ask from their production companies as to how to format and create this stuff. Because again, all bets are kind of off, linear versus non-linear, all that kind of stuff. It was inevitable that viewing experience of linear had to change, and maybe that's one example of how some stuff might actually structurally change going forward.
And what do you think the full impact of the lack of sports is going to be? And do you think we'll have sports in the fall?
Well, look, the only reason I keep my cable service is for sports, and it is a gigantic gulf of missing stuff for sports fiends like me. I think a lot of the sort of analyst crowd and naysayers would say that the only thing that was, and arguably still is, propping up the live linear bundle of cable satellite MVPDs is sports and live sports. Sinclair's made a big bet by buying a lot of regional sports networks, right? And there's not much sports to throw on those right now. So those are huge bets. I think it's premature to think. I can't imagine baseball coming back this year. I cannot imagine Major League Soccer coming back this year. I cannot imagine the NFL, even the holy and sacrosanct NFL, not being affected in some way, shape, or form. College football as well. This is a far bigger issue, and worldwide at that. So, while I admire the idea of trying to esports your way through some of the tough times, or trying to truncate or do tournaments or something at the quote unquote end of this, the reality is I don't know what the end of this is. I think, though, to my point earlier, the sports ecosystem, right, was largely overinflated, right? 30 teams in Major League Soccer, a $500+ million new franchise in Seattle for the NHL. The XFL, which was great, but Vince McMahon realizes that you can't nurture a brand new network when people aren't going to come to. So I fear, frankly, for the personal experience of sports. I think a lot of people are going to be leery of packing a stadium. I think that's going to be a different experience. I think games that are played in front of no fans are relatively soulless, but if it feeds the beast of television. But I have to think that there's going to be a gigantic rethink about what the media economics are about sports, because sports themselves are going to change because of all of this. So
yes,
this will touch everybody in the media ecosystem in sports in particular, for sure.
And then how do you look at local broadcasters right now? They've been hit really hard. At the same time, I understand that the NAB is petitioning for some relief funds for the broadcasters, largely because they're looked at as essential services in today's world.
So the hallmark of local broadcasters is their ability for local news coverage and knowing their communities. So I'll give you that, and I'll give the NAB that. I think the broadcast groups, right, largely consolidating right now, have been fortunate in having built out a second revenue stream for themselves over the last 15, 20 years with retransmission consent, which is basically getting compensated by MVPDs, cable operators, satellite operators, et cetera, to carry their signals. A novel idea in the 90s when the legislation was passed, but now, frankly, the saving grace for the broadcast industry, because advertising is, going into this COVID-19 crisis, was already on a local level largely flat, if not slightly down year over year. Yes, political advertising comes in every 2 to 4 years and is an uptick. Olympics and sometimes World Cup stuff, there's a halo for that. But when you now all of a sudden turn off quickly a large amount of advertising, that flat is, I don't know how down it's going to be. So the good news is that retrans is still holding steady, but as I said earlier, structurally, right, before this crisis hits, the idea of retrans consent by cable operators and satellite operators, we just said it before. People are unbundling and cutting those cords, especially now with sports not being part of them, at least in the short term. People absolutely now question whether they need 300 channels plus local stations and pay, $100 a month for that when, and frankly, consumers start to recognize that they're paying for broadcast channels that, dare I say it, you can get over the air with an antenna. So the idea of how advertising looks in broadcast television and local television, as well as the idea of retrans, those are both very challenged right now. Here's one last kicker. On the advertising front, local broadcasting is really the only part of the ecosystem of advertising that does not yet really have targetability, data-driven, addressable, those kinds of things that local cable does, lots of network television does, certainly streaming, anything streaming or delivered online or via mobile phones has digital targetability to it. Local broadcast doesn't, and in some respects, some people feel that that's sort of the vive la différence, right? That's the unique value, I guess, of local advertising. But I think it's now much more acute in people's minds that structurally the product of local broadcast television advertising should probably evolve with technology and targeting too. And maybe that will be hastened by this acute issue that we sort of have in front of us.
And
so
what will
there's positives there. Yeah.
What will it take for that to happen?
Well, look, I mean, you and I have been very knee-deep in this evolutionary technology in the broadcast space, colloquially known as, or consumer-wise known as next-gen TV, but technically known as ATSC 3.0. It's essentially a next-generation digital standard of over-the-air broadcasting. I think, frankly, that is going to be the infrastructure that will finally allow, with some level of elegance and confidence, not only the ability to do all kinds of great newfangled sort of services and offerings over the air, but specifically the ability to do more targeted and granular data-driven advertising. The problem, of course, with that is that it's still very much in construction mode. It's still a few years away from being, shall we say, consumer viable. I mean, it'll be available, but it's kind of like HD back in the day. It takes a couple of years to kind of get to sort of critical mass and the products and the services of that. So ultimately, I think broadcast over the air will be helped tremendously by that technology. I fear in the near term, the ability for local broadcast advertising to be competitive to what I think are going to be smaller marketing budgets that want more ROI, return on investment, guarantees and expectations from their ad spend versus broad-based brand awareness kinds of campaigns. To me, it's kind of an outlier, local broadcast TV advertising. I just hope that it can get a little bit more technically intelligent as most of other media, including especially video, becomes more targetable and measurable.
Okay, well, I want to move over to another slice, which is the Avon Slice, and increasingly growing in terms of consumption. A lot of connected TV consumption that is also going on. A lot of Roku consumption. Things people are looking for free services, and they're willing to bear the advertising. How is that market faring right now? Is it holding up? Is it growing? Obviously, people are streaming a lot more. What are your thoughts there?
So going into this crisis, right, the unbundling and the plethora of services, and still a few to come, right? Could be just launched. NBC's Peacock's coming out soon. AT&T's HBO Now coming out very soon as well. Those are all more competitive offerings. And smartly, some of them have full pay without ads, and some with ad-supported stuff. And plus, there are a whole ton of offerings that are completely ad-supported. Going into this crisis, I would have said, I still say, that the new economics of one's household television budget, right, was well underway, right? The idea of, do I need a cable bundle? Yes or no? A lot of people starting to say no. What do I replace that with? Well, I think Netflix, from a streaming perspective, is everybody's de facto number one. I think there's a small group, maybe a few more entrants to come, that are fighting for being the number two or the number three in one's bundle, right? Hulu and Amazon Prime, which arguably has a head start because of its business model, but all the other ones that have since come. And then there's the third tier is sort of the niches, right? Everybody individually has their own passion and niche, right? So if that's a WWE service, whether that's an auto racing channel, whether that's a BritBox or British, I mean, there's a lot of those, right? So everybody's household calculus is sort of those three tiers: the Netflix, the second tier of general entertainment stuff, and maybe a smidge of some focused and narrow niche stuff. But here's the kicker: there's a fourth level, right? And it's frankly, it almost is like a circle back to the first level, right? Nobody's not going to add an AVOD service to their Roku menus or their smart TV menus, right? Because why wouldn't you? There's no cost, there's no risk, frankly, in having Pluto or Izumo or Tubi or any of these other Roku channel, TiVo Plus. I mean, they're all these aggregators and frankly, some will have original programming, as we're starting to see too. So I think the Netflixes of the world, and to a certain extent, the second tier, if you will, general interest ones, will be quite robust. I think the niche players will have to figure out how many subscribers they need to stay economically viable. It can't be in the tens of millions, but I could see a BritBox being successful with 9 or 10 million, or a Curiosity Stream with 8 or 9 million, right? Those are probably the viable business model points. But AVOD to me is everybody's second choice, right? And we could argue about, maybe we'll talk about it, the method by which advertising is done in there and the ad loads and all that kind of stuff. But it's absolutely going to be a scalable proposition, and increasingly an alternative or parallel or a replacement to the linear television proposition that most marketers would have ad hoc gone to as the way to get brand awareness, when essentially AVOD is in everybody's home. And I think that's kind of the silver lining for all those players, is that the scale of those AVOD players is going to be substantial and probably as big, if not bigger, than Netflix's audience.
You were an early investor in Pluto. How do you distinguish between a Pluto versus a Izumo versus a Tubi? Obviously, all these businesses have been selling for hefty valuations to larger media companies. I just wanted to get, how does the consumer discover them? How does the consumer distinguish them? What are the strengths and the weaknesses of each of the offerings?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I obviously I'll speak for myself. I'm a geek for this stuff, right? Because it's what I have to deal with all day. But yeah, I don't know if people can just off the top of their heads know the distinctions between all of those, right? Pluto, very interesting, right? And again, 4 years ago, I couldn't even get people to, you couldn't get arrested trying to get meetings free online video streaming. What is it? Pluto's proposition really is, it's basically like a mini MVPD, right? It's broken out into channels, and what they do is they either deliver live streams from some of their partners, like a Bloomberg Television, for example, or they will comprise or allow their partners to create, if you will, faux linear channels, right? So it's replicating a live linear channel kind of. Right?
Like CBS Interactive News is a good example. Where
or a blend of those two. Cheddar is another good example, right? Where it's a little bit of live stuff, like during, say, the business day or during the news day, right? And then it's supplemented by lots of pieces that are stitched together later on. And Newsy, another great example, right? A lot of that stuff is not live. It is near live or essentially pre-recorded pieces that are stitched together to make it look and feel like a channel. So that's Pluto's model. You look at like Izumo or TiVo Plus or Roku channel, those are more, shall we say, aggregated menus of on-demand offerings. Now, some of those offerings, a lot of those offerings are either the same that you could get from each of those individual programmers' offerings online or on television, or are sort of highlights of such, or it's a hodgepodge, right? But what Roku and those entities do is they just aggregate from multiple sources an array, a bouquet, a buffet of ad-supported movies and television shows and content. Now, the problem with a bunch of them is not all of them are exclusive, meaning that you can very well see a lot of different series and movies on multiple free streaming platforms, right? So I think there's an interesting evolution, excuse me, of what syndication models look like. But I think over time you're going to see all of those AVOD entities aggressively move towards bolstering, which is, you know, right on the playbook of television, new networks, to create and bring to market more exclusive things that only their services allow you access to. I think right now it's kind of a free-for-all, and with all due respect, my understanding is that it's relatively easy to kind of create a free AVOD service with lots of stuff that's you know, available in the that's has no copyrights attached to them and public domain and all that kind of stuff. So the technology is not the problem. It's how do you exclusivize the content? But make no mistake, AVOD's here to stay. The advertisers before, during, and after this crisis are and will be continually interested in it because they know a lot of people are migrating to it. And that's where the audiences are. And it's frankly coming from a lot of linear television behavior.
But I would imagine from an advertising point of view that the CE manufacturers are going to have something to say about how you discover these services and how do they get compensated given the slim margins that CE manufacturers have.
So I equate that, Mary Ann, to like kind of a fungo bat, like when you're choosing up sides in a game, right? You know, you want to be that last one at the nub of the bat. I think that's that last sort of grip of the nub is kind of where the CE manufacturers and let's call them the streaming video operating systems players are, right? So for every Samsung or Sony or LG or you know, television set manufacturer who either is or believes they can create an operating system that makes their TVs totally smart, right? Let's put the apps in that layer, all that revenue and all that data really accrues to us without any intermediary. You have a group of, frankly, more TV and video experts like Roku, like Google Android, arguably Amazon Fire, if they decide to be more focused on enterprise systems, right? And there are probably a handful of others. It's really kind of this battle for the operating system of one's quote unquote television. And look, I'll be frank. I think Roku's technology is elegant, right? You know, I think Roku is one major consumer electronics company away from becoming the most influential and potentially game-changing operating system for all of this, right? They're in TCL TV sets, a lot of sort of mid-tier sets, and their navigation is very elegant. But the big three of LG and Sony and Samsung, you know, have so far defied it. I think all it takes is one of those entities to kind of either do a deal with Roku or perhaps even acquire it. And boom, you've got, you know, a Roku system as being maybe the de facto sort of operating system. So that's interesting stuff, but it's important because to the ad component of all that, you know, that's how Roku really makes a lot of its money right now, is their ability in their 40% of the streaming market to partially take advantage of advertising revenues as it runs across their platform, or wholly with stuff like Roku Channel, which is completely of their own. So, you know, it's a very interesting time, but that operating system idea, that's the piece I would sort of focus on and keep an eye out for, because it's kind of a battle royale, and it will control a lot of revenues and influence over the years as this stuff becomes more and more mainstream.
So talking about various technologies, and obviously Roku has been a tremendous success. There are a lot of other technologies that are being developed, being invested in, that could help accelerate and advance the television experience. You have a lot of experience working with a number of these businesses. What does that ecosystem look like right now? Because obviously there's a pause on funding, or perhaps there isn't a pause on funding. I just was interested in getting your thoughts and ideas on technologies to be looking out for, and then whether or not they can sustain this period. Yeah,
so there are two answers to that. One is sort of broad-based, and then one is more specific. I'll give you some examples. So broad-based, you know, having experienced this myself, 2008, 2009, while the convenient narrative is this is the time where it's more important than ever to kind of focus on technologies and experiences and ad scenarios that are more impactful and or measurable and that can really prove metrics of sales and ROI and that stuff that marketers really want to know. So when they put $1 in, they're going to get $3 or $4 out, versus a broad-based CPM, brand awareness thing, right? Which is very squishy and not directly attributable to sales, really. The problem with that, though, is that like a lot of things that are gestational and early stage, they take some levels of investment, whether that's people, resources, even investment and money, right? The bigger issue, frankly, is that most marketers tend to look at crises like this and their agencies more of it as a regression or reversion to the mean, if you will, right? Where it's harder to justify investments, people, resources, dollars into quote unquote newfangled things, right? Things that don't have any immediate proof points or returns on investment, and the reality is that you have less money to spend, and there's sort of a reflexive mindset of the reduced budgets and processes that we've got in front of us. Maybe we should just put those dollars and those investments into things that we know are safe and relatively scaled, and at least keeps our brand somewhat constant in a time of uncertainty. And then when things, quote unquote, settle down, we'll rethink through what our evolutionary processes might be. Now, look, that is a strategic decision, and the vast majority of media companies and those aligned with them or part of their ecosystem are much more executional and transactional and trying to preserve their business models than they are about investing in where things might evolve to, right? But there are some, right? There are some that are strategically invested in thinking through ahead of time, like that these scenarios might occur. That downturns, economic downturns are absolutely inevitable. They're cyclical, right? So,
right.
That is where media and advertising strategy metal is born and forged. Because when you come out of the other side, right, you're going to see it's kind of like creative destruction, Schumpeter's creative destruction model, right, where new entrants come in, old entrants try to figure out and which ones kind of evolve fast enough and stay around going forward. Some are going to fall away. Some new entrants are also going to fall away, but it's those that can kind of come out sort of the other side. And, I think you'll see some classic business model types, suffer more disproportionately. But interactive television is sort of an idea that kind of comes back into the fore. And I advise a lot of companies. And look, I will tell you, in 2009, I was a cast-off, right? Having created a ventures unit within Publicis Group. The after effect of that economic downturn, right? Ventures, putting bets in companies that were, strategically seen as being interesting and valuable and maybe a little bit advanced for our clients so that we could be their trusted partner as their agency because we're ahead of this and we know where things are going and we'll help you. That's looked upon as a luxury when you're trying to kind of consolidate money and put things into safe and provable environments, right? But of course, 2010, 2011, what starts to come back, right? A reboot. That entity and they all wanted to do ventures and all that kind of stuff again, right? And now whatever. I think that's very short-termism, but I understand it, but it's also, yeah.
Okay, so let's start talking about the future. 5 years from now, where do you see all of this heading to? And what are some of the bets people should be making right now in thinking about that horizon 5 years?
Yeah, so I advise a lot of startups, and I think the ones that are most interesting and more valuable now are ones that sort of help with things like automation of processes, right? So the ad buying and ad sales process, right, which is, it's not rocket science, but it frankly kind of needs to become such. It's a lot of paper pushing. It's a lot of data entry. It's a lot of lower level and lower salaried employees doing a lot of grunt work that is, if you look at the financial industry or all kinds of other industries, it's woefully antiquated. So just simply, and it's not so simple, but automating more of these labor-intensive processes, I think it is acute right now. It's staring media companies in the face of how inefficient, how extraordinarily expensive, and how it ridiculously set up this process is that has to be more centralized and made more automated. I think in terms of advertising targeting, the idea of addressability with privacy assumed, there are issues around related to that. I think anybody in the television realm who doesn't sort of see the benefits now of data-enabled or data-fueled targeting, including the ability to addressably serve or replace an ad, much like digital, should absolutely now see that that is an absolute structural change that should happen. Yes, I'm looking at you, local broadcasters. And then I look at stuff like ATSC 3.0 and the like. I think you're going to see television and video experiences become much more, I used the term earlier, interactive television-like. That's the old term, but the new term, right? Everything old is new again, right? So I've seen bits and starts and stops and starts of this interactive television idea where one can be more interactive and clickable with television and video. Well, guess what? The future of television and video, is playing out right now in places like House Party and Twitch, right? Look at Twitch. Twitch actually reverses the viewing experience, right? The NBA has a deal or had a deal with Twitch for games this season, and the games were not in the foreground and the interactivity in the background. It was actually the reverse, right? The game is almost the background while the interactivity of whatever it is, trash talking and betting or whatever people are doing in that sort of gamified kind of thing. So I'm not saying all of television and all of movies and all that stuff becomes interactive and populated with button pushes and all that stuff. But I do think you will see a lot more elegant integration of some of those more consumer activated elements, especially as sports comes back into the picture, in whatever form it comes back. Fair disclosure, I advise a company called Streamlayer here in Chicago. And true to its name, think about an overlay, a layer of interactivity, elegantly available, should you want it or not, as you're watching the game. If you want to do the betting, you can call that up. If you just want to see the sports stats from the truck, right? Guess what? You don't need the director to put that on the screen from the truck. You can actually overlay that or take that away. Do you want to trash talk with your friends? We'll call up the chat bot and you can do that. And you see some of these things happening in Facebook environments and in Snapchat and in YouTube, right? But to elegantly do that as part of the, let's call it the next generation television operating system or video operating system, something like a Streamlayer is a very interesting proposition. And there's a whole bunch of others. That's just one for them.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with a few of those types of businesses, and they are compelling and interesting, particularly for millennial and Gen Z audiences who are very much used to interactivity on a regular basis. And so do you think we'll all be still watching a lot of television 5 years from now?
I put television in quotes. I mean, I think there will always be an appetite for stories and quality content. I just think the methods in which one transmits and receives and ingests those things just evolves, right? Quibi, very interesting company, right? I think they're going to evolve their business model now given current conditions, but the idea of being able to fill one's quote unquote downtime on the go, whatever on the go is going forward, to be able to chunk up a linear narrative movie or a series in more episodic form. I mean, I said it before, everything old is new again. And this was before my time, but I heard back in the day, one would go to this thing called a movie theater. And then before the feature, something called a feature would start, you would see not only trailers, but vignettes and,
Serials.
Right, serials, right? And not the kind you eat, but episodic, adventures that, you'd have to come back to the theater the next week to see the second or third or conclusion of that episode.
My father grew up going to the Avenue in Greenpoint during the Depression, and they had, was it Flash Gordon, I think, were the episodes that they had before the big feature film. So
Yeah, to me, that's you know, and I don't think it took the COVID-19 sort of thing to kind of bring that to relief, but to me, there's nothing. Arguably, there's nothing new under the sun, right? The idea, the reality of why Instagram is so popular is because people like to take photos, right? Arguably, that's why it started, right? All these things emanate from basic content and or story and or narrative needs and environments. And the cool thing is that we're living in an age where there are so many different ways to create and distribute those. It's just the business models seem to kind of always in process. And that's, you know, I want to say that's job security, but it certainly is, it keeps things interesting and keeps us, at least for me, at least employed. And, you know, we're thankful for that, for sure.
Well, Tim, you are somebody who always has his finger on the pulse. I always learn from you.
You don't want to see where my fingers are right now, but you know.
Okay, good. Thank you so much for today. This was really great. I really enjoyed this conversation. And I encourage all of you Hoyas to watch out for other vidcasts that will be coming our way. Tim, before I go, where can people find you online?
Yes, thanks. It's Vertere Group. V as in Victor, E-R, T as in Tom, E-R-E, verteregroup.com. And
on the Twitter?
On the Twitter, you'll find we're at Vertere Group, but also my personal one is at Tim Hanlon, Hanlon.
Terrific. And one last plug.
Yeah.
Don't you have a podcast as well that
Yeah.
I just want to give you one last commercial.
Yeah, if you're into sports and sports history and pop culture, and you care about professional teams and leagues that have come and gone, so to speak, that are no longer with us. For example, the XFL, both versions. It's called Good Seats Still Available, and it's a great interview format of an exploration in all those sort of stories and teams and leagues. GoodSeatsStillAvailable.com, and on Twitter we're at Good Seats Still. So thank you for asking.
Okay, thanks so much, Tim.
Mary Ann, you're a delight.
Stay safe out there.
You're a delight. Thank you for doing this, and I appreciate your asking me.
Okay then, take care now.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.